December 16th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium, 0620 hours, -12 Celsius. Corporal James Holloway crouched beside a shallow foxhole and counted morphine syrettes, single-use pain injectors packaged in tin, left in his aid bag. 4. Around him lay 63 wounded men from the 101st Airborne, shivering under borrowed canvas, while German artillery walked closer in 3-minute intervals. Division supply had promised a resupply drop by noon, but thick fog grounded every C-47 within 200 miles. Holloway did the arithmetic: 4 syrettes, 63 men, and at least 8 more hours until the weather lifted. He could follow doctrine, 1 dose per casualty, no exceptions, or he could split doses and risk leaving men screaming through the night. The Geneva Rules treatment standards for wounded prisoners of war said nothing about rationing your own side's medicine, and the battalion surgeon was 2 kilometers west, unreachable by radio. The fog pressed against the tree line like wet wool, muffling sounds of German advance somewhere beyond the ridgeline. Holloway's aid station occupied a former Belgian dairy barn, its roof half collapsed from a direct hit 3 days earlier. 63 casualties filled every square meter of floor space, most wrapped in parachute silk scavenged from supply drops. 17 had fractures. 21 carried shrapnel wounds deep enough to require surgical debridement, removal of dead tissue to prevent infection. 9 showed signs of trench foot, tissue damage from prolonged cold and moisture exposure, severe enough that amputation might be necessary if they didn't reach a field hospital within 48 hours. The rest bore burns, concussions, or combinations that made triage feel like guesswork. The barns smelled of blood, antiseptic, urine, and the particular sweetness of gangrene beginning to take hold in wounds that had gone too long without proper cleaning. Private Eddie Marsh occupied the corner nearest the shattered milk separator, his left leg twisted at an angle that made Holloway's stomach tighten every time he looked. A Panzerfaust rocket, German shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon, capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor, had detonated 6 feet from Marsh's foxhole at dawn, sending a steel fragment through his femur and out the back of his thigh. Holloway had packed the wound with sulfur powder and tied off the femoral artery with catgut suture, but the kid's face had gone the color of old newspaper, and every 15 minutes he whispered the same question. When would the pain stop? Holloway had given him the last full syrette at 0500 hours. That dose should have held him until 0900, but now, barely 90 minutes later, Marsh was biting through a leather strap and making sounds that reminded Holloway of a dog he'd seen hit by a truck back in Pennsylvania. The strap was Army issue, cut from a rifle sling, and it already showed tooth marks from 3 other men who'd used it before Marsh. Sergeant Frank Del Vecchio appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the grey pre-dawn, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. He carried an M1 carbine, a lightweight .30 caliber weapon favoured by officers and support personnel, and a canvas satchel that clinked with the unmistakable sound of empty canteens. Del Vecchio had been with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment since Normandy, and his face carried the kind of lines that came from watching too many 19-year-olds die in ditches. He stepped over 2 privates sleeping back-to-back for warmth and squatted beside Holloway, his knees cracking with the sound that came from 6 months of jumping from aircraft and sleeping in frozen mud. Artillery crumped somewhere to the south, close enough that dust sifted down from the barn's remaining rafters. A timber groaned overhead. Del Vecchio waited for the sound to fade before speaking, his voice low enough that it wouldn't wake the sleeping wounded. "How many critical?" he asked. Holloway counted on his fingers, moving from left to right across the barn floor in his mind. 8, maybe 9 if you included the corporal, with the sucking chest wound, who'd stopped complaining an hour ago, which usually meant things were getting worse, not better. Del Vecchio looked at the 4 syrettes in Holloway's palm, then at the rows of men on the floor, then back at Holloway. "You planning to pick favorites?" he asked. It wasn't a question. His tone carried no judgment, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who'd made similar choices with ammunition and rations. Holloway tucked the syrettes back into his aid bag, a canvas pouch marked with a red cross that had faded to pink after months of rain and handling. Division said supply dropped by noon, he said. Delvecchio snorted, a sound halfway between laughter and contempt. Division said a lot of things. Last night, Division said they'd have a tank company up from Neufchâteau by 0400. Holloway had heard the radio traffic himself, the confident voices promising armor and air support and hot chow, as if confidence alone could burn through fog and German roadblocks. The only thing that had arrived on schedule was the artillery barrage at 0530, and that had come from the wrong side. German 105 guns firing from positions the intelligence officers swore didn't exist. Delvecchio pulled a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes from his field jacket and offered one to Holloway. Both men lit up using a single match cupped against the wind that knifed through the barn's broken walls. The tobacco tasted stale but warm, and for 30 seconds neither man spoke. Marsh made another sound, halfway between a cough and a sob, his body jerking against the restraints Holloway had improvised from parachute cord. Delvecchio glanced at him, then at Holloway. "That the femur?" he asked. Holloway nodded. Delvecchio smoked in silence for a moment, his eyes moving across the rows of wounded men as if conducting a count of his own. "I got 38 effectives left in the company," he said. "We're supposed to hold a 200-meter front. The Krauts have been probing since midnight, squads of 5 or 6 testing for weak spots. They pull back before we can fix their position, then try somewhere else 20 minutes later." Delvecchio's tone carried no emphasis, just the flat delivery of a man reciting logistics. "If we lose another 10% to wounds, we fold. The line breaks and they walk through." Holloway asked what that had to do with morphine. Delvecchio tapped ash onto the dirt floor. "It means if your screaming keeps my boys awake, they'll be too tired to shoot straight when the real push comes. It means half my perimeter is listening to this barn instead of watching their sectors. It means you do whatever you have to do to keep this barn quiet." Holloway watched the smoke curl toward the rafters, rising through the gap where German artillery had removed 8 feet of roof. The manual, a palm-sized booklet issued to every Army medic during basic training at Fort Sam Houston, specified dosages in milligrams per kilogram of body weight, with warnings about respiratory depression, cardiac arrest, and addiction. A full syrette contained half a grain, roughly 30 milligrams, enough to suppress severe pain for 4 to 6 hours in a man of average size. The math was simple when supplies matched demand. Splitting a dose meant half the duration, and possibly inadequate analgesia, which translated to men thrashing and crying out at unpredictable intervals. But giving nothing meant Marsh and 8 others would spend the next 8 hours in a state that Holloway's training instructor, a veteran of the First World War, had described with clinical detachment as incompatible with morale. The instructor had also mentioned in a voice that suggested personal experience that screaming was contagious, that one man in agony could trigger panic in a dozen others, and that panic in an aid station could spread to the perimeter faster than any German advance. Delvecchio stood and brushed dust from his knees, the motion revealing a tear in his trousers that someone had stitched with parachute cord. He looked down at Holloway with an expression that might have been sympathy, or might have been exhaustion, or might have been both. "Do what you can," he said. Then he left, his boots crunching over frozen mud as he headed back toward the perimeter, where 38 men waited to see if they'd survive another day. Holloway sat with the 4 syrettes in his hand, turning them over like dice, each rotation revealing the manufacturer's stamp and lot number. Each one was a small tube of clear liquid with a wire loop on one end and a needle on the other, sealed in a tin foil wrapper, marked with dosage information and warnings printed in type, so small they required good light to read. He'd carried syrettes through France and Holland, distributing them according to the manual's careful hierarchy: arterial bleeding first, then fractures, then burns, then soft tissue wounds. The system worked when supply lines functioned and casualties arrived in predictable numbers, and the enemy cooperated by not launching winter offensives through terrain the planners had declared impassable. It collapsed when you had 4 doses and 63 men and no promise that more medicine existed anywhere within a day's march. He opened his aid bag and inventoried the remaining supplies, a ritual he'd performed so many times that his hands moved automatically. 12 compression bandages, adequate for another day if no major arterial wounds came in. 8 rolls of gauze, thin but usable, already re-washed twice, and showing the grey colour that came from boiling in water that wasn't quite clean. 1 bottle of sulphur powder, half empty, the crystals starting to clump from moisture that seeped through the cap. 3 tourniquets, all army issue with the buckles starting to rust. A scalpel with a blade he'd resharpened on a whetstone borrowed from a Belgian farmer. 6 curved needles and 30 feet of catgut suture, enough for basic wound closure, but not enough for complex vascular work. 2 pairs of hemostats, one with a bent tip from the time he'd had to clamp a bleeder in the dark and grabbed wrong. A stethoscope with cracked rubber tubing, field dressing scissors that needed sharpening. A packet of water purification tablets, mostly useless since the only water source was a hand pump that drew from a well contaminated by a dead German soldier since December 12th. No plasma, no whole blood, no ether, no additional morphine, no pentothal, no antibiotics, no IV fluids, nothing that required refrigeration or complex supply chains or miracles. The manual included a section on battlefield triage, written in the bureaucratic prose that characterized all army documentation, probably composed by a medical officer who'd never worked in a barn with no roof. It divided casualties into 3 categories: those who would survive without treatment, those who would die regardless of treatment, and those whose survival depended on immediate intervention. Holloway had memorized the criteria during training and had applied them successfully in 4 previous engagements, twice in Normandy, once in Holland, once during the drive through Belgium before the Germans decided to push back. The system presumed that medical resources, while limited, would be sufficient to address the middle category. It did not address scenarios in which resources fell so short that the middle category exceeded capacity by a factor of 15. It did not address scenarios in which the middle category included men who might survive with full treatment, but would certainly die with partial treatment, or might survive with partial treatment if you got lucky, or might survive with no treatment at all, if you believed in miracles. Private Marsh made another sound, a rising keen that ended in a bitten-off gasp as his jaw clenched on the leather strap. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth where a tooth had cut through his lower lip. Holloway stood and walked to the corner, picking his way past outstretched legs and sleeping men and puddles of liquid. He didn't examine too closely. Marsh's eyes were open but unfocused, the pupils dilated despite the dim light filtering through the broken roof. His pulse, when Holloway checked it against his own watch, ran at 140, shallow and thready, the kind of pulse that said the body was running out of options. The leather strap between his teeth showed fresh bite marks, deep enough that the kid was going to need dental work if he survived, which depended entirely on what Holloway did in the next 30 seconds. "When does it stop?" Marsh whispered. His voice sounded like boots on gravel, barely audible over the background noise of men breathing and artillery rumbling in the distance. Holloway lied and said, "Soon." The lie came easily, one of dozens he'd told in the past 72 hours, lies about evacuation times and survival rates and whether the wound looked bad. Marsh closed his eyes, and for a moment Holloway thought he'd passed out, which would have solved one problem while creating another. But then Marsh opened his eyes again and looked directly at Holloway, the kind of look that carried a question the kid didn't know how to ask. Holloway unwrapped one of the syrettes, held it up to check for air bubbles, a pointless gesture since the morphine was factory sealed, but training was training, then stopped. He looked at the rows of wounded men stretching across the barn floor, 70 feet from wall to wall, each man a separate equation of pain and time and probability. Most were quiet now, either asleep or too weak to complain, or managing their pain through whatever internal mechanism let soldiers function with injuries that would have put civilians in shock. 3 others besides Marsh showed visible signs of severe pain: a corporal with burns across 40% of his torso, the skin blackened and weeping, caused by a white phosphorus grenade that had cooked off in his ammunition pouch; a private whose right hand had been amputated at the wrist by shrapnel, the stump wrapped in gauze that needed changing every 2 hours, and a lieutenant with a compound fracture of the pelvis who'd been carried in on a stretcher at 0200, the bones visible through torn muscle, talking in a calm voice about his wife and 2 daughters back in Ohio. 4 men, 4 syrettes. The arithmetic worked, at least on paper. But Delvecchio's words circled in Holloway's mind like a phonograph needle stuck in a groove, repeating the same phrase over and over: 38 effectives. 200-meter front. Do what you have to do. Holloway looked at Marsh, then at the lieutenant with the pelvic fracture, then at the syrette in his hand. The needle gleamed in the weak light filtering through the barn's broken roof, catching a stray beam of winter sun that had found its way through the fog. He made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like falling. The moment when you step off a ledge and gravity takes over and all you can do is wait for the ground. Holloway broke the syrette's seal with his thumb, a practiced motion that made a soft click, then drew out the plunger slowly, watching the liquid level drop until he'd halved the visible volume. The plunger stuck slightly at the halfway mark, as if the syrette itself was questioning the decision. He injected Marsh with the reduced dose, pressing the needle into the meat of the kid's thigh and depressing the plunger until half the morphine entered the muscle tissue. Marsh's breathing changed within 90 seconds, the rapid shallow gasps smoothing into something closer to normal, the tension draining from his jaw as the morphine bound to receptors in his brain and spinal cord, and told his body that the pain wasn't real, or at least wasn't important. Holloway capped the needle carefully. A half-used syrette was useless if the needle got contaminated, and tucked it back into his aid bag. He moved to the lieutenant with the pelvic fracture, a man named Carson who'd graduated from West Point 18 months earlier, and still carried his class ring on a chain around his neck because his fingers had swollen too much to wear it. Carson hadn't complained once since arriving, hadn't asked for morphine, hadn't asked for anything except water and news about his platoon. Holloway knelt beside him and explained what he was doing, why he was doing it, and what it meant. Carson listened, nodded, and said he understood. Holloway repeated the process, splitting a second syrette and saving the remainder. Carson's face relaxed within 2 minutes, the lines around his eyes softening as the morphine took hold. The corporal with the burns, a man named DeMarco from Brooklyn who'd worked as a plumber before the war, received half of the 3rd syrette. DeMarco had been screaming intermittently since 0300, short bursts of sound that stopped as abruptly as they started, as if he was rationing his own agony. The morphine silenced him completely. The private with the amputated hand, whose name Holloway didn't know because the kid had arrived unconscious, and his dog tags were missing, got the 4th half dose. The kid didn't wake during the injection, but his breathing steadied and the grimace left his face. By 0700 hours, all 4 men rested quietly, their pain blunted but not eliminated, reduced to a level that was bearable if you'd been a soldier long enough to recalibrate your understanding of what bearable meant. Holloway sat with his back against the milk separator, a piece of rusted equipment that the barn's original owners had abandoned when the Germans first arrived in 1940, and stared at the 4 half-empty syrettes now back in his aid bag. 4 more half-doses, enough to buy another 4 hours of relative peace, maybe less if the reduced dosage wore off faster than he'd calculated. After that, he'd have to find another solution, or watch the arithmetic unravel one scream at a time. The fog outside began to thin as the sun climbed, revealing the skeletal outlines of Bastogne's buildings in the middle distance, church spires and rooflines that stood dark against the grey sky. Somewhere to the east, A machine gun chattered in short, disciplined bursts, 3-round controlled fire that indicated training and ammunition discipline, answered by the deeper thump of an American Bayar, a Browning automatic rifle that weighed 20 pounds and fired 30 caliber rounds at 500 per minute. The sounds rose and fell like a conversation in a language Holloway didn't speak, but understood perfectly, the language of men trying to kill each other across frozen ground. At 0815 hours, a runner arrived from battalion headquarters, a corporal named Jensen with a radio backpack that weighed 35 pounds and a message scrawled on a scrap of paper torn from a ration box. Supply drop delayed until weather clears. No ETA, conserve all resources. The message was signed by a Major Holloway had never met, stamped with an official headquarters seal, as if that made the news more official. Jensen's face carried the expression of a man who'd delivered the same message to 6 other positions and knew exactly how it would be received. The corporal asked if Holloway needed anything urgent. Holloway asked for morphine. Jensen laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Get in line." There were 42 aid stations in the Bastogne perimeter, and every one of them was asking for the same thing. Then he left, jogging back toward the command post with the radio antenna bobbing above his helmet like a target marker. Holloway pulled out his field notebook, a small green book with pages already stiff from dried blood and mud, and began calculating in the margins. If he continued splitting doses at 50%, he could stretch 4 remaining half syrettes into 8 quarter doses. That would cover 8 more men for 2 hours each. But 2 hours wouldn't get them to noon, and there was no guarantee the fog would lift by noon anyway. The weather briefing at 0600 had predicted clearing by mid-morning, but the same briefing had predicted clearing the day before, and the day before that. If the fog didn't lift, the drop wouldn't come, and he'd be back to having nothing, while men screamed loud enough to be heard at the perimeter. He thought about the alternatives, running through the list of improvised solutions that medics whispered about but never put in official reports. Some medics he'd heard used alcohol to dull pain, but Holloway had no alcohol except for a small bottle of grain spirits reserved for sterilizing instruments, and he'd learned in training that alcohol was a poor substitute for real analgesics, more likely to cause vomiting than relief. He'd also heard stories, never confirmed, always third-hand, of medics improvising with cold compresses or pressure points, or even hypnosis, techniques that worked for mild pain but did nothing for shattered femurs or third-degree burns. The manual mentioned sedatives like sodium pentothal, but Holloway had none. It mentioned reassurance and psychological comfort, which struck him as the kind of advice written by men who'd never smelled gangrene or held intestines in place with bare hands while a kid begged you to let him die. At 0830, Sergeant Del Vecchio returned, moving through the barn like a man conducting an inspection, pausing at each wounded soldier to check pulses and examine dressings with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this enough times to know what mattered. When he reached Holloway, he crouched and spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of artillery that had started up again to the south. 3 more wounded coming in, he said. Shrapnel from a mortar. One's bad. Holloway asked how bad. Del Vecchio made a gesture near his abdomen, a spreading motion that indicated both location and severity. Holloway nodded. Abdominal wounds had a high mortality rate even with immediate surgery, which meant the incoming casualty would likely fall into the category of those who would die regardless of treatment, unless he landed in the narrow middle ground where morphine and pressure and luck might keep him breathing long enough to reach an operating table. The 3 wounded arrived 10 minutes later, carried by soldiers who looked like they'd aged a decade overnight, their faces grey with fatigue and cold. 2 had superficial lacerations, treatable with pressure and gauze, and a tetanus shot Holloway couldn't provide because the vaccine had run out 3 days ago. The 3rd, a private named Kowalski from Chicago who'd been in country for 6 weeks, had taken mortar fragments through the lower right quadrant of his abdomen. Holloway cut away the uniform with his field scissors, revealing a wound that looked worse with each layer of clothing removed. The fragments had perforated the peritoneum, the membrane lining the abdominal cavity, and possibly the intestines, which meant infection and sepsis would set in within hours unless surgical intervention came fast. Kowalski's blood pressure registered at 90/60 when Holloway checked it with his portable cuff, too low but not yet critical. His pulse ran at 110. He was conscious, lucid, and clearly terrified, his eyes moving between Holloway's face and the wound in his abdomen as if trying to understand which one would tell him the truth. Holloway packed the wound with sulfur powder, using almost a quarter of his remaining supply, and applied a compression bandage tight enough to slow the bleeding, but not tight enough to cut off circulation. He knew both measures were temporary at best, battlefield expedients that bought time without addressing the underlying problem. Kowalski needed a surgeon, an operating room, antibiotics that wouldn't be invented for another decade, and about 6 hours of careful work by someone who specialized in abdominal trauma. What he would get, at best, was morphine and hope, and Holloway wasn't sure he had enough of either. Holloway reached for his aid bag, then stopped, his hand hovering over the canvas pouch. He had 4 quarter doses left. If he gave one to Kowalski now, he'd have 3. If Kowalski survived long enough to need a second dose, which seemed likely given the nature of his wounds, that would leave 2, and Marsh and the others would need more in another 90 minutes, maybe sooner if the half doses wore off faster than predicted. The arithmetic kept getting worse. Kowalski looked up at Holloway, his face carrying the grey pallor of early shock, the colour that came before the body started shutting down non-essential systems. "Am I going to die?" he asked. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, the voice of a man who wanted information rather than comfort. Holloway said no, and in that moment he believed it, or at least wanted to badly enough that the belief felt real. He'd learned that lies in medicine were sometimes more effective than morphine, that certainty in a medic's voice could steady a pulse and slow bleeding in ways that defied the textbooks. Kowalski nodded, seemed to consider this, then closed his eyes. Holloway unwrapped one of the quarter-dose syrettes and administered it into Kowalski's thigh, pressing the needle deep into the muscle. The private's breathing eased within minutes, the rapid shallow gasps smoothing into something closer to normal. By 0930 hours, the fog had lifted enough to reveal the full perimeter, a ragged circle of foxholes and improvised strongpoints that surrounded Bastogne like a noose pulled almost tight. German forces occupied the high ground to the east and south, dug into positions that overlooked the American lines with fields of fire that made movement in daylight a gamble. Occasional small arms fire crackled through the trees, single shots or short bursts that indicated snipers working the edges of the perimeter. Holloway heard the distant rumble of tanks, the distinctive clatter of treads on frozen ground, but whether they were American Shermans or German Panthers remained unclear. The radio at battalion headquarters crackled with competing reports. Reinforcements en route from the south, German panzers advancing from the north, air support available in 30 minutes, air support grounded indefinitely, supply drop confirmed for 1100, supply drop cancelled due to weather. Holloway stopped listening. The only thing that mattered was the aid bag in his lap and the 3 remaining quarter doses inside it. At 1000 hours, Private Marsh began to stir. His morphine had worn off faster than Holloway had predicted, probably because the reduced dose lacked sufficient potency to saturate all the receptor sites, or because Marsh's metabolism was running hot from infection, or because the universe had decided that nothing in Bastogne was going to work according to plan. Marsh's face twisted, the muscles in his jaw bunching as pain reasserted itself with the sudden intensity that came when opiates wore off. He bit down on the leather strap again, hard enough that Holloway heard teeth click against each other. Holloway knelt beside him and administered another quarter dose, watching the morphine disappear into muscle tissue that was starting to show signs of inflammation. Marsh's eyes rolled back, and his jaw went slack. The strap fell from his mouth, leaving indentations in the leather deep enough to catch rainwater. 2 doses left. The lieutenant with the pelvic fracture, Carson, began moaning at 10:15. The sound was low and continuous, a rumble that came from somewhere deep in his chest, the kind of sound that indicated pain beyond what conscious control could manage. Holloway gave him a 1/4 dose. Carson's moaning stopped, replaced by shallow breathing that concerned Holloway more than the moaning had. 1 dose left. At 10:30, a shell landed 30 meters from the barn, close enough that the concussion knocked dust and straw from the rafters and sent a shockwave through the floor that Holloway felt in his chest. A fragment punched through the barn's south wall and buried itself in a wooden support beam, the impact sending splinters across the room. No one inside was hit, but the noise woke half the sleeping casualties, and the sudden movement triggered fresh pain in men who'd been managing to endure in silence. The corporal with the burns, DeMarco, started to scream, a high sustained sound that filled the barn like a siren, bouncing off the walls and the remains of the roof until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Holloway moved to his side and placed a hand on the man's shoulder, speaking in low tones, trying to calm him without medication he no longer had. He tried everything he remembered from training: steady voice, firm touch, reassurance about evacuation that might or might not be true. DeMarco screamed louder. Holloway looked at the last 1/4 dose in his aid bag. 1 final injection. Enough for 2 hours, maybe 3, for 1 man. He could give it to DeMarco and buy silence, restore the quiet that Del Vecchio had said the perimeter needed, or he could save it for the next critical case, the one he knew would arrive because casualties always arrived in war, especially in sieges, especially in Bastogne, where the Germans had decided to make a stand and the Americans had decided to hold. Or he could do nothing and let DeMarco scream until his voice gave out, or someone at the perimeter decided that 1 wounded man wasn't worth the compromise to everyone's sleep. He thought about Del Vecchio's words again. Do what you have to do to keep this barn quiet. He thought about the 38 men holding the perimeter, already exhausted, running on 2 hours of sleep in the past 48, now listening to screams that told them the aid station had run out of options and maybe hope. He thought about the manual and its careful categories, none of which addressed the question of collective morale versus individual suffering, none of which explained how to choose between 1 man's agony and 38 men's ability to fight. Holloway unwrapped the last 1/4 dose and gave it to DeMarco. The screaming stopped within 60 seconds, replaced by ragged breathing that gradually smoothed into something closer to sleep. The barn went quiet except for the ambient sounds of men breathing and artillery rumbling and the wind coming through gaps in the walls. He sat with an empty aid bag and 63 wounded men, and no promise of resupply. The clock in his head read 10:45. Division had said noon. Holloway looked at the sky through the hole in the roof and saw nothing but grey, the same grey that had been there yesterday and the day before. The grey that grounded aircraft and kept supplies in warehouses and made promises meaningless. At 1100 hours, a new sound cut through the ambient noise of distant combat. It came from the west, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder with each passing second, distinct from artillery or small arms fire. Holloway stepped outside the barn and looked up, shielding his eyes against the weak winter sun that had finally found its way through the clouds. 3 C-47 transport planes emerged from the cloud layer, flying low and slow, their engines straining against the weight of cargo containers slung beneath their fuselages like bombs. The aircraft flew at maybe 800 feet, low enough that Holloway could see the pilots in the cockpits and the crew chiefs standing in the open cargo doors. Parachutes blossomed behind the aircraft, white canopies spreading against the grey sky, drifting down toward the snow-covered fields surrounding Bastogne. Some landed inside the perimeter, settling into fields that American soldiers sprinted toward. Others drifted beyond the American lines, pushed by wind that carried them toward German positions where soldiers would claim them and wonder at American wealth that could afford to lose 20% of every supply drop. Soldiers sprinted toward the containers, rifles slung across their backs, moving with the urgency of men who understood that supply drops represented the difference between holding and collapsing. Between another week and another day, Holloway watched as a container landed 50 meters from the barn, its parachute settling over a ruined fence like a shroud. 4 men reached it within seconds, cut the straps with knives and bayonets, and began hauling wooden crates back toward the aid station, their boots churning through snow that had fallen overnight. The first crate held bandages and sulfur powder, enough to restock what Holloway had exhausted in the past 3 days. The second held plasma, bottles of yellow liquid that needed to be mixed with sterile water before use, more valuable than gold in a place where blood loss killed more men than bullets. The third held morphine, 200 syrettes packed in neat rows, each row labeled with lot numbers and expiration dates, more than Holloway had seen in one place since training at Fort Sam Houston. He opened a tin with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold but from the relief that came with seeing problems solved by logistics rather than improvisation. He stared at the contents, each syrette gleaming like a small promise that suffering could be managed and pain could be controlled, and the gap between injury and treatment could be bridged with chemistry rather than faith. Sergeant Del Vecchio appeared beside him, materializing out of the fog with the silent efficiency that came from 6 months of infantry work. "Told you division delivers," he said. His tone carried no irony, no acknowledgement of the hours between promise and fulfillment, the hours when Holloway had split syrettes and made calculations, and wondered if his decisions would look different in hindsight. Holloway nodded and began restocking his aid bag, filling the canvas pouch with morphine and bandages and sulfur until it bulged with supplies that transformed impossible equations into solvable problems. By 11:30, every critical casualty had received a full dose of morphine. The barn went quiet except for the sounds of breathing and the occasional murmur of men talking in their sleep, or discussing the supply drop in hushed tones that indicated they understood how close things had come. Holloway moved through the rows, checking pulses and changing dressings, falling back into the familiar rhythm of medical care restored by the arrival of adequate supplies. He avoided looking at the men he'd rationed earlier, the ones who'd endured hours of inadequate pain control because he'd chosen to split doses rather than pick favorites. None of them complained. Most didn't even know what had happened, didn't know that the morphine they'd received had been half of what the manual prescribed, didn't know that Holloway had gambled with their suffering, and won only because logistics had aligned with necessity at almost exactly the right moment. At 1200, a convoy of ambulances arrived from the rear, half-tracks fitted with stretchers and staffed by surgical teams who'd driven through the night from field hospitals in Luxembourg. They began loading casualties for transport, working with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this dozens of times. Private Marsh went out on the first truck, his shattered femur stabilized with splints, and his pain controlled with morphine that would last until he reached an operating table. The corporal with the burns, DeMarco, followed. The lieutenant with the pelvic fracture, Carson, was loaded with extreme care, 6 men lifting the stretcher to avoid jarring his broken pelvis. Private Kowalski, still alive, still grey, but breathing steadily enough that the surgeon accompanying the convoy gave him a 50-50 chance if they could get him to surgery within 2 hours. By 1400 hours, the barn held only 12 men, the ones whose wounds were minor enough that they'd return to duty within days. Twisted ankles, minor lacerations, mild concussions, the injuries that came from fighting in winter without proper equipment. Holloway sat on an overturned crate that had contained plasma bottles and inventoried his restocked aid bag, 120 syrettes. Enough for a week, maybe 2, if casualties stayed moderate and the supply lines held and the Germans didn't decide to make another push. He tucked the bag under his cot, a piece of canvas stretched across a wooden frame that one of the barn's original owners had probably used for storing hay, and closed his eyes. Sergeant Del Vecchio found him there an hour later. The fog had returned, thicker than before, and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. Del Vecchio carried a canteen of coffee, real coffee liberated from one of the supply crates, rather than the chicory substitute that usually passed for coffee in the army, and he poured a cup for Holloway without asking. Both men drank in silence, the coffee hot enough to burn, but neither man cared. After a while, Del Vecchio spoke. "How many did you lose?" he asked. The question was casual, the tone that soldiers used when discussing things that mattered without acknowledging how much they mattered. Holloway said none. Del Vecchio raised an eyebrow, the gesture suggesting surprise or disbelief, or possibly both. "None," he repeated. Holloway nodded. Del Vecchio seemed to consider this, his eyes moving across the barn floor as if counting empty spaces where wounded men had been. He shrugged. "You did good," he said. Then he stood and walked back toward the perimeter, where 38 men waited to see if tonight would bring another German probe or just more cold and more fog. Holloway sat alone in the barn as the light failed, and the temperature continued to drop toward the -15 that the weather briefing predicted for midnight. Outside, artillery rumbled in steady cadence, the German guns ranging closer as the day wore into night. Each shell a reminder that the siege wasn't over, that tomorrow would bring more wounded and more decisions and more arithmetic. He thought about the 4 syrettes he'd split, the decisions made in the space between doctrine and necessity, the men who'd suffered longer because he'd chosen to ration rather than allocate. He thought about Private Marsh biting through leather and DeMarco screaming until his voice broke, and Carson lying silent with a broken pelvis, and Kowalski asking if he was going to die. He thought about the manual and its careful categories, and the section on triage that presumed resources would always be sufficient for the middle category. He pulled out his field notebook, the pages now stiff with cold as well as blood, and recorded the day's events in the clipped shorthand required by Army medical documentation. 63 casualties treated, 4 critical, 8 serious, supplies exhausted at 10:30 hours, resupply received at 1100 hours, no fatalities. He closed the notebook and tucked it back into his field jacket, where it rested against his chest like a talisman. The morphine in his aid bag represented more than pain control. It represented the promise that suffering could be managed, that the gap between injury and treatment could be bridged with chemistry and care, that soldiers wounded in service to their country would receive adequate analgesia regardless of supply constraints. But the day had revealed the fragility of that promise, the way it depended on weather and logistics and decisions made by men far from the front who believed their own confident voices when they said noon and meant maybe. At 1800 hours, a private from headquarters arrived with new orders, typed on a sheet of paper that showed signs of having been handled by multiple people. The 101st Airborne Division would hold Bastogne until relieved, no withdrawal authorized, all medical personnel to remain at current positions and continue operations. The orders were signed by a general whose name Holloway recognized from newspapers but had never met. Holloway acknowledged the message and watched the private disappear into the fog, moving carefully through terrain that might contain German infiltrators or American sentries or nothing at all. Then Holloway lay down on his cot, his aid bag within arm's reach, close enough that he could grab it if the alarm went up, and tried to sleep. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by artillery and the sounds of men talking at the perimeter, and the memory of 4 syrettes turning in his palm like dice. He dreamed of arithmetic. 4 syrettes divided among 63 men, 4 becomes 8 becomes 16, each division cutting the potency in half, until the morphine becomes so dilute it carries only the memory of relief, the placebo effect that sometimes worked better than no treatment at all. In the dream, wounded men lined up outside the barn, orderly and patient, forming a queue that stretched into the fog. Each one asked the same question: when will the pain stop? Holloway counted and recounted the syrettes, trying to make the numbers work, trying to find the equation that would let him say yes to everyone without lying about what yes meant. But the math never resolved. For every dose he gave, 2 more men appeared, and the line grew longer, stretching past the barn and into the fog and beyond sight, becoming infinite. He woke at 0200 to the sound of shells landing close, maybe 100 meters south of the barn. The barn shook, and frozen mud rained down from the remaining sections of roof, pattering onto sleeping men like hail. Holloway grabbed his aid bag and ran outside, where a squad of soldiers was hauling wounded back from the perimeter, dragging stretchers through snow that had started falling again. 5 men, 3 with shrapnel wounds, 1 with a bullet through the shoulder, 1 unconscious with blood streaming from a scalp wound that looked worse than it probably was. Holloway triaged them in the dark, working by feel and the dim light of a kerosene lantern someone had hung from a fence post. His hands moving automatically through procedures he'd performed enough times that they no longer required conscious thought. The man with the head wound needed immediate evacuation, but the ambulances wouldn't return until dawn at the earliest, possibly later if the roads were compromised. Holloway packed the wound with gauze, applying pressure until the bleeding slowed to a seep, then administered morphine from his restocked supply. The man with the bullet through the shoulder got morphine and a pressure dressing. The 3 with shrapnel wounds received treatment according to the manual's careful hierarchy, each man assessed and treated based on the severity of his wounds and the likelihood of survival. All 5 received full doses of morphine, adequate analgesia, proper care according to doctrine. The supplies held. The system worked. The arithmetic balanced. By 0400, the incoming wounded had stabilized, and the artillery barrage had tapered off into sporadic harassing fire, single shells fired at random intervals designed to deny sleep rather than destroy positions. Holloway sat in the barn entrance and watched the eastern sky begin to lighten, the stars fading as the sun climbed somewhere beyond the clouds that still covered Bastogne like a lid. Sergeant Del Vecchio passed by on his way to check the perimeter, his rifle slung and his breath forming clouds in air that had dropped to -17. He nodded to Holloway. "How's the supply?" he asked. Holloway said good, adequate, sufficient for current needs. Del Vecchio grunted and kept walking, his boots crunching through fresh snow. The day that followed looked much like the one before. Casualties arrived in 1s and 2s, mostly from small arms fire and shrapnel, the routine attrition of a siege where both sides conserved resources and waited for the other to make a mistake. Holloway treated them according to doctrine, distributing morphine and bandages and sulfur, as the manual prescribed, following procedures that worked because the supplies matched the need. No rationing, no splitting doses, no decisions made in the space between doctrine and desperation. But the memory of the previous day remained, lodged in Holloway's mind like a fragment that couldn't be extracted without causing more damage. He thought about it while changing dressings, while recording vital signs in his field notebook, while eating cold rations from a can that had been packed in 1942. He thought about the moment he'd decided to split the first syrette, the feeling of falling without knowing where the ground was or whether it would hold. He thought about DeMarco screaming, and the silence that followed the last quarter dose, and the relief he'd felt when the C-47Ns appeared through the fog, the relief that came from being proven right by circumstances beyond his control. The manual offered no guidance on how to feel about decisions made under conditions the manual had never anticipated. It specified dosages and procedures and priorities, comprehensive instructions for battlefield medicine that worked when supplies matched demand. But it said nothing about the weight of choosing who suffered less rather than who suffered not at all. Nothing about the arithmetic of rationing morphine among men who all deserved full doses. Nothing about the moment when you realize that following doctrine means watching men scream while you sit with empty hands. Holloway had followed the spirit of the manual even as he'd violated its letter, prioritizing collective welfare over individual comfort, buying time with reduced doses, gambling that resupply would arrive before the gamble failed. The gamble had paid off. No one had died. The wounded had been evacuated. The supplies had been restored, but the edge between success and failure had been thin enough to see through, measured in minutes and milligrams and the whims of weather that grounded aircraft. On December 18th, the German offensive stalled, exhausted by American resistance, and overextended supply lines that couldn't keep pace with the advance. On December 22nd, the weather cleared and Allied air power returned in force. P-47 fighters and medium bombers that turned the roads around Bastogne into graveyards for German armor. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army broke through from the south, relieving the siege and opening supply lines that had been closed for 10 days. Holloway treated wounded through all of it. His aid bag never empty again, his supplies replenished by regular drops and convoys that arrived with the punctuality that had been promised but rarely delivered during the siege. The arithmetic stayed balanced. In January, the 101st Airborne moved west to rest and refit in France, where hot showers and clean uniforms and 3 meals a day felt like luxuries beyond measure. Holloway went with them, carrying his aid bag and his field notebook, and the memory of 4 syrettes split 8 ways. He never spoke about it to anyone except in the flat language of official reports, and those reports recorded only the outcome: 63 casualties treated, no fatalities in aid station, supplies maintained through rationing procedures. The decisions that had produced that outcome remained his alone, filed in memory alongside 1,000 other moments that separated survival from collapse. Years later, long after the war ended, and the soldiers went home and Bastogne became a town rather than a siege, Holloway would think about that morning when he'd sat with 4 syrettes and 63 wounded men. He would think about the moment he'd broken the first seal and drawn the plunger to half, committing himself to a course that had felt less like medicine and more like faith, less like science and more like prayer. He would think about the men who'd suffered longer because he'd chosen to ration, men who'd bitten through leather and screamed until their voices broke. And he would think about the men who'd survived because he had, men who'd lived long enough to reach operating tables and go home and have children and grow old. The manual had taught him to treat casualties. The war had taught him to count. Private Eddie Marsh returned to duty in March 1945, after 3 months of rehabilitation at a hospital in England, where British surgeons had pinned his femur with steel rods and taught him to walk again. His leg healed with a slight deviation that gave him a permanent limp, a hitch in his stride that would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. But he could march and shoot and perform the tasks required of an infantryman, which was all the army cared about. He rejoined the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment in Germany and fought through the final weeks of the European campaign, crossing the Rhine and pushing east until the Germans surrendered in May. He never knew that the morphine he'd received in the dairy barn at Bastogne had been half a dose, or that Corporal Holloway had spent the rest of that morning wondering if the decision had been right. The lieutenant with the pelvic fracture, Carson, spent 6 months in a hospital in England, undergoing multiple surgeries to pin and stabilize bones that had shattered into fragments. He was medically discharged in July 1945 with a pension and a Purple Heart and a letter from his commanding officer that praised his leadership under fire. He walked with a cane for the rest of his life, unable to stand for more than 30 minutes without pain, but he walked. He returned to Ohio and taught high school mathematics, standing at a blackboard and explaining equations to teenagers who had no idea what he'd done in Belgium. The corporal with the burns, DeMarco, underwent 12 surgeries over 18 months, skin grafts and reconstructive procedures that left him with scars across 40% of his body. But he retained function in both hands, which meant he could work, which meant he could support the family he started in 1947. He returned to Brooklyn and resumed his trade as a plumber, working until he was 70 and never mentioning the war except to say he'd been in Belgium. Private Kowalski survived his abdominal wound through what the surgeons described as luck and constitution. The fragments had missed his major vessels by millimeters, and the sulfur powder Holloway had packed into the wound had prevented infection long enough for antibiotics to finish the job. He went home to Michigan in August 1945, worked in a factory that made automotive parts, raised 4 children, and never spoke about the war except to say he'd been lucky, which was the truth as far as he understood it. Corporal James Holloway remained with the 101st Airborne Division through the end of the European campaign, treating casualties in Germany and Austria, and finally Berchtesgaden, where the division occupied Hitler's mountain retreat, and Holloway set up an aid station in a building that had once housed Nazi officers. He treated hundreds more casualties, distributed thousands more doses of morphine, and never again found himself with 4 syrettes and 63 men. He kept the manual in his aid bag and followed its protocols with the precision of a man who understood that rules existed because their absence led to chaos. But he also kept the memory of the morning he'd improvised, the morning the rules hadn't been enough and he'd made decisions the manual had never contemplated. After the war, Holloway returned to Pennsylvania and enrolled in medical school at the University of Pennsylvania using the GI Bill, which paid tuition and living expenses for veterans who wanted education. He became a general practitioner in a small town outside Philadelphia, where he treated fractures and infections and delivered babies, and watched people live and die according to the arithmetic of medicine and chance. He never mentioned Bastogne to his patients, and when they asked if he'd served in the war, he said yes and changed the subject to their symptoms. In his office, he kept a small wooden box on a shelf behind his desk, positioned where he could see it when he looked up from patient files. Inside the box were his service medals, his discharge papers, a photograph of his aid station crew taken in France, and a single morphine syrette, empty, the needle long since dulled by time. He'd kept it as a reminder of the morning he'd chosen to split doses, the morning he'd learned that the distance between doctrine and necessity could be measured in milligrams and hours, and the weight of decisions that felt like falling. On December 16, 1944, Corporal James Holloway had faced a choice that reduced to arithmetic: 4 syrettes, 63 men, 8 hours until resupply. He'd chosen to split the difference, to ration rather than allocate, to spread inadequate resources across maximum need, rather than give full treatment to a few, while others screamed. The choice had worked because the supplies had arrived and the men had survived and the arithmetic had balanced in the end. But Holloway knew, sitting in that barn as the fog lifted and the parachutes drifted down, that the balance had been fragile. He knew that if the C-47As had been delayed another hour, or if the fog had persisted another day, the screaming would have resumed and the soldiers on the perimeter would have grown more exhausted, and the arithmetic would have failed. He knew that his decision to ration had been correct only in hindsight, only because the gamble had paid off, only because luck had aligned with necessity at exactly the right moment. The manual had not prepared him for that kind of decision. The manual presumed a world where supplies matched needs and choices divided neatly into correct and incorrect, where every wound had a treatment and every treatment had adequate resources. The war had shown him a different world, one where correct and incorrect dissolved into a fog as thick as the one that had grounded the C-47S, a fog in which the only compass was the arithmetic of suffering, and the gamble that tomorrow would bring enough to cover the debts of today. Corporal James Holloway had made that gamble. He had counted 4 syrettes and 63 men, and chosen to split the difference. The men had lived. The arithmetic had held. And in the decades that followed, when Holloway reached for the wooden box and held the empty syrette in his hand, he remembered not the supplies that had arrived, but the hours before they came, the hours when he'd measured morphine in fractions and hope in minutes, and learned that sometimes the right decision was the one that left you wondering if there had been a better choice you'd missed. The war ended in May 1945. The men went home. The barn in Bastogne fell to ruin and was eventually demolished in 1953, replaced by a memorial that listed names and dates and battles, but said nothing about morphine or fog or the arithmetic of suffering. The wounded healed or didn't, lived or didn't, remembered or forgot according to their own internal calculus. The manual was revised and reprinted in 1946, its protocols updated to reflect lessons learned from 1,000 aid stations across a dozen countries, new sections added on cold weather injuries and siege conditions and resource management. But the question that Corporal James Holloway had faced on the morning of December 16, 1944, remained unanswered in any edition of any manual. When the supplies run short and the casualties mount and the fog refuses to lift, Do you give full doses to a few or partial doses to many? Do you follow doctrine and let men scream, or do you improvise and gamble that tomorrow will bring enough to cover the debts of today? Holloway had chosen to improvise. He had split 4 syrettes into 8 half doses and then into 16 quarter doses, stretching inadequate resources across maximum need, buying time with chemistry and hope. The choice had worked because the C-47S had arrived and the morphine had been real and the arithmetic had balanced in the end. But in the hours before the parachutes appeared, before the crates were hauled to the barn and the supplies were restored and the wounded were loaded onto ambulances bound for hospitals, where surgeons waited with ether and scalpels and all the tools that Holloway lacked, in those hours when the barn held 63 men and 4 half-empty syrettes and nothing else, Corporal James Holloway had learned what the manual could never teach, that medicine, like war, was a gamble played with stakes measured in lives, and that sometimes the only way to win was to bet everything on a fog lifting and a plane arriving, and the arithmetic holding just long enough to reach the other side. The morphine had arrived, the men had lived, the gamble had paid off, and Corporal James Holloway had carried the weight of that gamble for the rest of his life, not as a burden but as a reminder that sometimes the distance between right and wrong was measured in milligrams and minutes, and the courage to split the difference when the rules ran out and the fog refused to lift, and the only choice left was the one that felt like falling.